Good evening, everyone. My name is Sarah Hummel, and I am a Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, I'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for this evening's event. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and to strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and does not endorse political issues or candidates. Before we begin this evening's program, I would just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones or any devices that make noise. Now I would like to turn the program over to Bob Bixby, Executive Director of the Concord Coalition.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for coming. During this campaign season, the Concord Coalition has been trying to inject some discussion about fiscal and economic policy, the big challenges that will be facing the next president. I guess you might say we've met with mixed success in that regard and injecting these issues into the campaign, but we'll nevertheless keep trying. And tonight, we're going to hear from two of the nation's leading economists about two problems that will be facing the next president. One is income inequality, and the other is the federal budget deficit, which went up this year for the first time since 2009, and is projected to keep going up thereafter. Income inequality is an issue because it looks as if, by many measures, incomes have been relatively stagnated over the past 40 years or so, and many economists are trying to figure out how can we both address income inequality and the rising budget deficit? Can we address one without harming the other? What sort of a role does the federal budget have to play in these issues? So tonight we're going to hear from Douglas Holtz-Eakin, who is a former director of the Congressional Budget Office, has worked in the Republican administration, Council of Economic Advisors for the Bush administration. So we'll say they'll come at it a little bit more from the right side, but I know Doug quite well and is not a partisan in any sense. Jared Bernstein is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. He has been an advisor to Vice President Biden, economic advisor, and is a noted expert on labor policy and income inequality. Jared, again, is coming at it from a more liberal point of view, you might say, but like Doug, is a thoroughly credible fellow on the issues and on the numbers. And so we'll look at the different perspectives. The moderator for tonight's discussion will be Janet Hook. Janet is one of the nation's leading political reporters and covers Congress for the Wall Street Journal. Prior to that, she covered Congress for the LA Times. And Janet and I were talking, and she and I have been probably having phone conversations about the budget for 20 or 25 years. And this is probably only about the third time we've been in the same room. Anyway, so welcome all to our panelists, and I invite you to come up. And Janet, I will turn the program over to you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Bob. And thanks everybody for coming. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm at the Wall Street Journal. Actually, my day job for the last year has been covering the presidential campaign. And so, as Bob pointed out, there's been a little absence of substance. So this is actually a great pleasure for me to come and hear these distinguished gentlemen talk about policy. And these issues in particular, on the campaign trail, we actually haven't heard much about income inequality since Bernie Sanders dropped out of the race. And we haven't heard much about tackling the debt and the deficit at all. So I think we'll be talking about issues that what the candidates have been saying has implications. But what I'd really like to do is just start with some of the the basics from, and to hear from both of you about, on the question of income inequality, how you define and see the problem of income inequality, and even how much of a problem is it? What's the goal? I mean, what's the goal of a policy that addresses it? And I go to Doug first because I've heard Doug say on some occasions a little bit of some income inequality isn't a bad thing. So let's hear from the experts.
So first of all, thanks for the chance to be here. It's always fun to be back in this room. It's a fantastic institution. I really appreciate the chance to join you tonight. So here's what I think about it. So first of all, on why I say that, it's just to remind people that I, like my parents, had two children who were not identical. One of which had trouble getting out of his or her PJs and stayed in the middle of the day. The other was quite industrious. If they played out that way their entire lives, the one would be quite successful, the other I have concerns about. That income inequality derived from those kinds of attributes is not a bad thing. That's what our system rewards. People who invent stuff, people who work hard, people who just sit around and do nothing shouldn't be rewarded. So equalizing them is the danger. So let's just stipulate that. That's not general, that's going on. Here's how I think about the income inequality problem, differently than Jared, I promise you. I'll try to do it quickly. I'm going to assert a lot of things about data and facts with absolutely no charts or anything. I promise you everything I say is exactly right. But really this, if you look at the data on earnings in the labor market, beginning in the mid-1980s and continuing, adjusted for inflation, the bottom started to fall, the top started to rise. And we saw this very noticeable widening in the earnings distribution for those who went out there and tried to earn a living. Somewhere in the mid to late 90s, the bottom stopped dropping, but the top continues to rise, and it continues to rise unabated. So if you look at labor earnings, there's a clear inequality that continues to materialize, and now is largely focused on high earners getting more and more. If you move from just labor earnings to sort of earnings after income taxes and transfer programs and all the things that we do at the state and federal level, that difference gets muted. It's still there, but you see basically the social segment working. You don't see the bottom fall as much, you don't see the top get up as much because the tax system is progressive. And then if you move from that which is earnings to consumption, you try to actually measure how people live. What cars do they have? What food do they eat? Where do they live? Things like that. What you find is no particular discernible rise in inequality at all. And indeed, the top seems to have come down ever so slightly, and the middle risen a touch. Now, none of those are hard and fast facts. Like, those are trends in the data. Different people read them different ways. They're all subject to lots of technical nuances. But my takeaway from this is, if we have a problem, that problem is we're getting too many rich people. It's a problem I'm willing to live with. The other problem we have, however, is that bottom has just stuck there. And we have far too many people in poverty. We have the same fraction of the population in poverty now we did 10, 20, 30 years ago. So when I think about how to address this, I think, number one, let's get the economic growth rate up, grow faster so that we're not sort of fighting over the same pie. And two, let's concentrate very heavily on the low end. Let's have an anti-poverty effort that gets people more successful, gets them into the labor force, gives them the chance for labor force success, where the dividing line is skills and no skills. And so I'm looking for pro-work policies to get people into the work and better education and skills to sort of solve the problem from the bottom. The top is going to be a political football always, but I'm afraid in focusing too much on the top, we're missing what are, I think, the real problems, which is in the bottom end of the distribution.
So I have just a few factual disagreements there. By the way, both my kids are geniuses, so haven't been able to have that.
Oh, the one of the kids are genius, just ask them.
Oh, you're right. No, so no, I'm sympathetic to the different children's proclivities. But I do think it is important to distinguish where we agree and disagree on the facts of the case. So I think, let me just start with two things that I think Doug gets, that I think the data are telling a different story than Doug told. They're important. The first is on poverty. It is often said, and I know Paul Ryan says this, for example, that Ronald Reagan's quip that we fought a war on poverty and poverty won is correct, because the percent who are poor now is much, which is around about 13.5% right now, which is around about what it was 30, 40 years ago, as Doug suggested. But that is only because we fail to measure in our poverty statistics all of the most of the increased transfer payments that Doug himself was just touting. And if you, and of course, you're never going to gauge the progress you've made against poverty if you leave out the very measures that you've introduced, the earned income tax credit, the expansion of nutritional benefits. If you leave those out of the poverty metric, you're not going to see the improvement that you've made. So if you go back to the 1960s, when the war on poverty began, appropriately measured, incorporating the increase in what we've done, poverty was about 25% then, it's about 14% now. So about a 40% decline in the rate. That's a very dramatic improvement, and in fact, in one sense, I disagree with Doug's point that those endpoints are equal. I don't think they are, but it very much underscores the point that he made that in fact, the safety net offsets a good bit of the market-driven inequalities that Doug talked about. The consumption inequality is another area where we disagree, and that has to do with, unfortunately, you can go into the literature and cherry pick whichever you like. There's certainly, I think, convincing literature that shows an increase in consumption inequality. But I think what's important there, and this actually has very relevant economic overtones, is that, in fact, look, if your earnings are stagnant, and this is key, the earnings of middle-income workers. In fact, the earnings of the bottom 90% of the workforce have been stagnant for decades. If your earnings are stagnant and your consumption is going up, the only way that can happen is if you borrow. And in fact, we've had a great deal of leveraging among low and middle income people that ended up kind of exploding vis-a-vis the housing bubble at the end of the last expansion, and we're still climbing out of that hole. I think the impact of increased earnings inequality on the need for middle and low-income families to borrow if they're going to get ahead is actually an important economic problem. One last point of disagreement that is important here. So I disagree with this idea that we should sort of just, love the rich and leave them alone, or, in terms of evaluating both our inequality problem and what we're going to do about it problem. See, I actually land where Doug kind of does there. There's a lot we could do through public policy to offset not just the inequality, because I agree with you, there's always going to be some. The question that you posed, Janet, which is very important, is how much? And here's my answer. When the level of inequality gets to the point where the barriers that it creates to middle, and particularly lower income family, lower income kids being able to get ahead, when income inequality creates mobility barriers, so kids aren't able to live in neighborhoods that afford them the kind of opportunities they need, aren't able to attend schools that afford them those kind of opportunities, aren't able to access the kind of just environment. There's this whole science now of the toxic stress that has negative impacts on the brains of poor children because they're living in environments where there may be lead in the water, all the way through to there's no libraries for them to go to. When that kind of level of economic inequality starts to dampen income, dampen the mobility, to basically preclude children from realizing their potential the way Doug and my kids, whatever they bring to the table, they'll be able to realize their potential. That's a problem. And in order to address that, you need public policies, and we're going to talk about them, I'm sure. And where are you going to get the revenues for those public policies? Well, since most of the income has been, the market income has been going to the top, I actually very much agree with the idea that says, let's start there. Let's actually start there, and this actually taps into Hillary Clinton's approach. Let's start there. We're going to have to raise more revenues, and I don't think we can do it just from the top 1 or 2 or 5%. I probably part from some of my Democratic friends on that regard, but I do think that's the right place to start.
Sure.
So, I think Jared says some very important things. I want to highlight a couple, because it's just sort of how you think about the problem. I think it's always important to identify the problem you're trying to solve before you run off with a solution. So the question is, are you trying to solve poverty? In which case, I agree with Jared, you want to keep track of, for example, the earned income tax credit, our largest anti-poverty program, in calculating the fraction of people in poverty. Or are you trying to have a cultural self-reliance and self-care where where Americans can, on average, go to the market and get a standard of living that is satisfactory? Or are they going to be reliant on those transfers from the government? Without picking, those are two different problems. And people come to different bottom lines because they think about it differently. They call them both anti-poverty. They aren't really. So those things get mixed up a lot. The second thing which I agree on, and I'll stop.
That's right.
I'm running the clock here. The mobility issue is really important. And there's been a study at Harvard, by a guy at Harvard, who studied this, says that over the past 50 years, social mobility in the U.S. has roughly not changed. But there's huge geographic dispersions in places where mobility seems to advantage, places where it's stayed fine or gotten better. And those do seem to meet public policy, and I think that is a place to focus.
And just one quick codicil there. If you look at
We
that,
can go all night.
I very much.
You can ask your last question.
I'm glad you brought up the work. It's Raj Chetty, right? So the work of this guy, Raj. So he has a graph that I think is so germane to what I'm talking about. And his graph plots all these communities in the country, thousands of communities he breaks down, and he graphs the mobility in those communities against the inequality in those communities. And the negative correlation is striking. Communities with high levels of inequality have low levels of mobility, meaning that kids that grow up there are less likely to get ahead than kids that grow up in communities with much less inequality. It's precisely my point that the concern here has to be generated not by some specific level of inequality, but at the point where it starts diminishing children's ability to realize their potential. And I think Chetty's work shows we're there in a lot of places.
So I'm not completely certain that you guys see the problem the same way, but I'm going to ask you the same question though. As you see income inequality as a problem, what role do you think the federal government has in addressing it? And lightning round, name the first 3 things you would like the government to do to help address the problem that you see.
Okay, what was the first part of the question?
What's the federal government's role?
Role. And then 3 things.
3 things that you'd like to see done.
Sure. I think that the federal government's role is to make, basically where I landed in my last question, the federal government's role is to ensure that not just children, but that families are able to realize their intellectual and their economic potential. If there are what I would call artificial barriers holding them back, which might be an insufficient educational opportunity for a kid or the absence of a gainful job for that kid's parent, then there's a role for the federal government to do something about that. So that's one. Progressive taxation is another, because I think that there are ways in which, for example, we talked about income inequality. Wealth inequality is actually much more concentrated. So it used to be the case, go back to the late 1970s, 20% of the wealth was held by the top 1%. It's now 40%. And in fact, while income inequality has been fairly stagnant over the last 7 or 8 years, wealth inequality keeps going up. So asset accumulation and the way the tax system is really tilted with so many Donald Trump's returns actually gave us a pretty good look at that. The way the tax system is really tilted in a way such that those with a great deal of asset income have so many advantages. So it is both a way of exacerbating wealth inequality and not taking the revenues you need to address my first part, which is making sure people and kids and their parents can realize their economic, their spiritual, their intellectual potential. So I would try to balance those out through government policy. I think that a more progressive tax system that was much less favorable to sort of asset-based income, I'd close a ton of loopholes in that regard, and I would use that to offset the kinds of immobility problems that we've been talking about. That would include some neighborhood interventions. There are a lot of kids in neighborhoods that really block their mobility. It would certainly include educational interventions. I'd have a minimum wage that was adequately high. I would probably reinforce a bunch of labor standards that have eroded over the years. I'd like to see, this is not so much, I think there are ways in which the federal government could help, but I'd like to see people be able to form unions more without so much pushback, because I think that sort of collective bargaining power is a critical offset to the some of the trends that have boosted inequality over the years. And it's no coincidence that as the union density has declined, the share of the income going to the top 10 or 1% has increased. That negative correlation is very clear. So I think about ways to do that. So progressive taxation, using that to boost some of the work supports, the EITC, the CTC. We should talk about some of those. Hillary Clinton's a very good child tax credit, CTC child tax credit idea, and educational opportunity, and then the labor standards and the bargaining power piece of the puzzle I try to put in place.
Okay. Doug?
So I think the federal government's primary job is to create the environment in which you can have broad prosperity. And to me, the top problem at this moment is subpar projected long-run growth. So from the end of World War II to 2007, the U.S. economy grew rapidly enough on average that even with population growth, boomers, GDP per capita, the rough measure of the standard of living, doubled roughly every 35 years. So in one person's working lifetime, you could imagine the standard of living double, and that was the route to whatever their version of the American dream might be, whatever they wanted. With projected growth of only 2% going forward and population growth, the standard of living is going to double every 70 to 75 years. And so the pace at which prosperity arrives in the United States is too slow in my eye. It exacerbates all of the other pressing public policy problems that we have, whether they be budgetary in nature, addressing adequate mobility and opportunity, and only the federal government's position to deal with these events. So I think that should be it. And as an example, you hear a lot of talk about infrastructure. It's everybody's favorite thing right now, magic infrastructure. But we've never actually had a discussion on what's the federal government's role in infrastructure policy. And to me, it should be raising economic prosperity, and the national government's role should be national connectivity. That's what it can uniquely do. States and regions are much better suited for taking care of the legacy infrastructure systems. And so, you know, I have a relatively traditional view of allocating responsibilities to the area where people are best suited to deal with it. So the federal government's at the top, worrying about growth. That means things like tax policy. And I'm with Jared, I think we need a tax reform. Lots of folks on the left want more revenue, I get that, but the route to more revenue is a tax reform, not something that just jacks up rates or targets people. Tax code should mean something, it should display a set of values, and I think we should have a pro-growth tax code that raises more revenue than we thought. I also think that the federal government should get out of labor appropriate. Right now, one of the phenomena we have is that we need an entitlement reform. We need a Medicare, Medicaid, Affordable Care Act, Social Security. That sort of set of programs needs to be reformed, A, because they're an impediment to faster growth, they're producing the red ink. B, because those programs are not good programs in and of themselves. They're going to run out of money, and this is our social safety net. There's no way to run a railroad, so to speak. But C, and this is the important thing, right now, as you know, people campaign, not as much as we'd like, but you know, the new ideas come up. So for example, both have talked about how can we help with child care costs in the United States. Both candidates have said something on that. It's one of the few policy issues to emerge. There's no money to take on a new priority because the existing entitlements have been set on an autopilot course that consumes too much in the way of federal budgetary and national resources. That needs to get fixed. It's wrong to lock in our priorities from 1960 when we were in 2016, 2020.
Yeah,
Well,
we need to do that.
Let me reflect on a couple of things. Oh, are you done? I didn't mean to cut you
Not
off.
a chance.
Oh, sorry.
I get three, right?
Yeah.
And then the last one I would go back to the anti-poverty effort. I do think that's the federal government should be a top priority. And I want to sort of acknowledge what Jared said about being fast and loose with the data, because I was. One of the poverty problems we used to have was old age poverty. Social Security, to an extraordinary extent, solved that. So the fact that the top line measured my way, so let's just put aside the measuring issues. The fact that the top line hasn't changed that much tells you there's been an increase in poverty somewhere else, and that single mother childhood poverty is a problem that has to get fixed. That is a big issue, and I put the federal government's resources there.
So I forgot to mention one of my a policy that I increasingly think is really important, and it is very much for the role of the federal government. One of the areas that I don't know where Doug is on this, but one of the areas where I disagree with various conservatives, and it does have to do with this poverty issue, is especially when I hear like Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan has thinks about poverty, thinks of himself as an anti-poverty kind of warrior, I think, to some extent. But he has an underlying assumption that all a poor person has to do to get a job is to want the job. And there's this, it's a very supply side sort of orientation. It really ignores what labor economists call the demand side of the job market, just how many gainful job openings there are. And there are neighborhoods across this country where people, they're job deserts. People just can't find the work there. But there's actually a lot of work to do in this land. I mean, some of it, it is true that there's more automation, but there's always been more automation. There's still a lot of work to do, particularly in what they call the caring professions, childcare, healthcare, elder care. And I think that one thing that the feds need to start contemplating is direct job creation. In places where, we want poor people to work. I am not one of the, I'm kind of with Doug on this. I don't think you should, if somebody's able-bodied, I don't think you should pay them not to work. We want people to work, but if the jobs aren't there, I think we should have a direct job creation program. Now, you may think that sounds like some sort of a New Deal thing, but in fact, in the Recovery Act, we had a very effective program that subsidized private sector employment to the tune of 80 or 90% of the base pay, and it lasted for 3 to 6 months, so it wasn't a permanent thing, and it often helped people break that barrier from non-work to get into the job market. So I put that on my list, and I want to get back to this social insurance thing, because Doug and I have a different perspective on that. I'll just say this now, because I don't want to filibuster too much. Yeah, not too much. I have a very different view. I don't see the social insurance, Social Security or Medicare as nearly as as nearly as kind of I don't want to put words in your mouth, but sort of the desperate crisis kind of theme. If you look at the projections, Social Security now costs us 5% of GDP in about 30 years or so. It's supposed to cost us 6% of GDP. Now, another percent of GDP is not trivial, and we have to meet that challenge, and it's going to have to be met through higher revenues and perhaps if there can be some benefit cuts that don't hurt middle or low income people, I'm happy to talk about them. But in Medicare, maybe from 3% of GDP to 5% of GDP, a heavy lift, no question, but not a lift that can't be done. And and here we strongly disagree. The Affordable Care Act is actually helping by lowering the cost at which healthcare costs are rising. So we're actually making progress towards that. The social insurance package, which is so critical to the well-being of older Americans, is affordable, but it's going to take work that our gridlocked Congress has been unwilling to do.
Well, and Jared, the gridlock Congress and also the presidential candidates really are not addressing a lot of the issues that you're talking about.
Sure.
Whether it's in terms of entitlement reform.
But don't make a false equivalence there either, Janet. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I was actually going to ask you to talk about the two candidates and on both fronts. I mean, if we could start on the question though of income inequality and then maybe talk about entitlements and debt reduction second. One thing that really strikes me is that the concern about, there is this sense in the electorate, as I've been covering the campaign, of people feeling this great sort of frustration with being in the middle, the middle class kind of. So that it would seem like an occasion where it would be a setting where it would be right for the candidates to talk straight on about these issues.
About which issues?
About income inequality and how to redress the whatever imbalance they see between the rich and the poor. But I do think a lot of the things they've talked about have implications for it. So if you could talk about the two candidates and what you hear from them in this realm, and how you would distinguish between what the world would like, what the world would be like under a Clinton versus a Trump economic policy. Do you want to start?
Sure. So let's talk first about sort of economic and budgetary policy. The facts, as laid out by the Congressional Budget Office, are that if you leave the federal budget on autopilot over the next 8 years, so presumably the 2 terms of whoever's elected, in 2024 you end up with a deficit that's $1 trillion. A little over 60% of it is interest on previous borrowing. So interest is now Bigger than the Pentagon is a federal activity. It's our second largest program. And we are mechanically entering into a debt spiral. How fast we get in there and just the economic consequences of it are unknown, but there's nothing good on the table if you leave the federal budget on autopilot. Each candidate has made budgetary proposals that essentially say this. I, Hillary Clinton, promised to invent a new entitlement program for everyone I can think of, and I will pay for with higher taxes on higher income individuals, and that all adds up. I'm not going to increase the debt a bit. And I take her to her word. They try to pay for all their proposals. And Donald Trump has said, I, Donald Trump, am going to have a massive tax cut, and I'm going to take on all this energy policy and regulatory policy and trade policy that would produce 3.5% growth on average, and that growth is going to give us so much more revenue that I'm not going to make it anymore. So it all adds up. And so what both of them are saying to the American people is, we have a huge problem, and I have no plan to deal with it. None. I find that appalling. And as I said, because Jared's already sketching out, we're going to go 3%, 4%, 5% of GDP, just take care of old problems. There's no money to take care of any new problems. That doesn't strike me as a very defensible strategy. The other downside, this is just the underlying economic performance. Clinton's plan is going to harm economic growth at a time when growth is bad. I think that's sort of pretty universally understood. Moody's put out what was perceived to be a fairly laudatory analysis of her plan, but as it turns out, all of the growth in that comes from immigration reform and getting about 600,000 new immigration jobs. Even with that, the real median household income declines under the policies on her watch. That doesn't strike me as dealing with the middle class pressures a bit. Right? You've got a bunch of new entitlements to paper over this, but the core economic function is not delivering to the middle class. He's just a hot mess. He's incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. And his immigration policies would create a huge recession. So on the sort of things which are, how do you deal with the budget, the economy, and the middle class, I think this is it's a scourging election. Nothing on either side appeals to me very much.
So I'm a little less down the mouth around. Yeah, no. Doug is actually representative, I think, of the average American who is not happy with either choice. And I think more recent polls show far less happy with the Trumpian choice than the other choice. But no, I don't really go there. And there's a couple of things where I have a pretty strong disagreement. I mean, one thing, by the way, is I think, so that $1 trillion in debt, what is that as a share of GDP? Like 8% or 5% or 6%?
It's 5.5 to 6. Okay,
5.5 to 6%. So I actually think you should say it that way. I think when you say $1 trillion with it, completely not linked to the denominator, which is GDP.
Twice as big as the rule of thumb that says it's safe.
Yeah, no, I think that deficit is I think that's not a trivial deficit at all. But I think there's no kind of basis for, $1 trillion where, 5% of GDP. I mean, actually, in the Great Recession, the deficit was 10% of GDP. It came down because of economic growth. Now, I don't think we want to get to that 5% of GDP. And one thing that Doug and I totally agree on, and it's implicit in Janet's question, and Bob is very good on this point, is that it is absolutely the case that way too many politicians go out there and tell you, you can have this and you can pay for it with that. Right? You can have this much and you can pay for it with that much. That is the snake oil that a lot of politicians push. What I think is sort of inspiring is that Hillary Clinton is not doing that. I mean, Hillary Clinton is saying, in order, and by the way, Bernie Sanders did this too. You can poke fun at our friend from Vermont all you want. I don't know which direction it's in. All you want, but he said it's left, right? Thank you. Good point. He said the same thing. Now, when Bernie said it, he was talking about going from about 21% of GDP expenditures to 32, or you can call it Sweden, and that wasn't going to happen. But Hillary is talking about a plan that costs something in the neighborhood of 5 or 6% of GDP, and actually it's less than that. Well, anyway, she raises 1.4 trillion in revenues over 10 years, and that's about what her plans cost. So when Doug says she doesn't add to the baseline debt or deficits, that's true. Where I disagree, so here's a politician actually saying we can do this, but we have to pay for it. Now the wrinkle there is that we means the top 5% of households above 250,000. So I want to be clear about that. But to me, that's very different than saying what Donald Trump says is I can cut revenues by $6 trillion over 10 years. I can raise the defense budget, which he says. I can protect Social Security and Medicare, which he says, and I can kind of balance the budget. You know, that's impossible. And that's pure snake oil. I think what Clinton is saying is not you can have this and pay this for it. It's that you can have this, but we're going to have to raise this kind of income to pay for it. And I think that's qualitatively different. Where I disagree strongly with Doug is he says there's no money to take care of new problems. There's no money to take care of new problems. The reason there's no money to take care of two problems, there's no money to take care of new problems is because there is just a complete and total unwillingness to raise the revenues that we need to meet the new problems, to meet the challenges that we face. And you can forget about inequality and anti-poverty. Just talk about demographics. Based on demographics alone, we are going to need new revenues. Based on infrastructure, we can't support our transportation infrastructure on a gas tax that was set at 18.4 cents per gallon in nominal terms in 1993 and hasn't been raised since. Okay, that is magical thinking. If you think that you can pay for a transportation program on a 25-year-old tax that hasn't been adjusted. So there is money, resources to be used, but we have to agree that we're going to raise them. We need more revenues. And the idea that you can say there's no money to deal with them is the same as saying we're never going to raise the revenues we need, and I simply don't agree with that.
So, Jared, your illustration about Hillary and her policies of, she says, we'll spend this amount and we'll pay for it. That means that she's proposing deficit neutral policies and nothing that deals
Correct.
with longer term debt problems.
So,
and hold on, let me, if
sure.
I can just finish it. This isn't actually a question, this is me talking. But so, and this is an unusual campaign in that the Republican also is not talking about long-term debt reduction. So we have a debate where nobody's really kind of proposing the really hard things. And it could be that you can never do that in a presidential campaign. Yeah. But I have this feeling that if you don't even have candidates talking about it, that there's sort of very little prospect that when either one of them will be elected, will address the problems that our friend Bob Bixby has been working his entire life to address. So,
I don't think the problems are as bad as you and Doug say they are. So I'll talk about that one.
Yeah. And I'm not saying, I don't know what the
Bob.
magnitude is.
They are bad.
But it is the case that you can, if you pursue deficit neutral policies,
right.
You don't do anything
Correct.
about the longer term.
That's a great point.
And in that context, now this is a question, it's a little bit off topic, but off of what I just said. But so when you say that you think that the entitlement problem isn't as bad as what Doug says, does that mean that you don't think that something structural needs to be done to address them?
No, I do think that something, I'm not sure what you mean by structural, but something needs to be done to address them. To some extent, something is being done. And let me give you one example. So before the Affordable Care Act was introduced, so this is when the 20 million people that it's covered were not in the mix. The Congressional Budget Office said we were going that we were going to spend our healthcare expenditures as a share of GDP were going to go from 9% to 17% or something like that over the next 30 years. Now they think they're going to 9% to 13%. A 4 percentage point of GDP decline in the increase of healthcare costs post ACA. That's not all the time. That's not all the ACA. But that's precise. Now is that a structural change? To some extent, yes, because it comes from the changes in the healthcare delivery system, which are helping to suppress cost growth. But yes, there's going to also need to be new revenues, as I said.
I think Doug has a question here.
A question for me? Go ahead, Doug.
So this comes up all the time. So this is essentially what Jared says a lot, other Democrats say all the time. CBO used to be forecasting a 5-alarm fire. It's now forecasting a 3-alarm fire.
True.
It's all good.
I agree with that.
No, we're still toast.
5-alarm is not the same as 3-alarm.
Still need the fire department, right?
The outcomes are still unacceptable.
Agree.
So it's not evidence of anything.
No, that's ridiculous.
So
wait, 4 percentage points of GDP is nothing?
It's something that's never happened. It's in the future. I made those projections. So just
well, wait a minute. Now I take your point.
So now let's look at the substance of the programs and why I'm concerned. Social Security's promise to the American people is that it will cut benefits across the board in about 20 years and it'll be 25% for everyone, even those in retirement. That's a horrible promise, but that's why it's still considered actuarially sound, and the trustees can deliver reports. That's disgraceful.
Agreed.
That has to be fixed now, so there is some sense of urgency.
Agreed.
And that's real money. Medicare, money going in versus money going out, gap is $300 billion a year, every year, rising, 10,000 new beneficiaries every day. We get subpar outcomes for all the money that we spend. That's a financial disaster and should be fixed immediately. Jared's responsibility up, the Affordable Care Act fixed that. Not so fast, whereas healthcare costs started to slow down prior to the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Can't take credit for that. It was in the private sector. The place where it's growing most slowly is actually employer-sponsored insurance, which the ACA did not touch. It's the one thing they didn't screw up. Thank them. It really didn't deliver any demonstrable savings in its core programs, accountable care organizations, Medicare shared savings programs. The place where healthcare spending slowed down was in the Medicare program, but for reasons that no one, including the CPO, understands. Healthcare costs per beneficiary have risen more slowly. It probably has something to do with the demographics of the baby boom entering into the program, but that's just the jury's still out. So you just can't.
No, I think you're completely
it's
wrong.
all good.
Okay, now
It's
I got
not
my
all
head.
good.
So look, it's not all good, no. But neither, I never said it was all good. We actually are facing a serious, hold
We
on.
should just spend some more money.
No. Well, there is, yes, it's going to cost more money, correct. That's my whole point. When you say, and I quote,
No, new programs.
when you say, I quote, there's no money to take care of new problems, I think you're fundamentally wrong because you're chopping off a very important source, which means we're going to have to raise some revenues. And by the way, here's how you would do it in Social Security. So here's what I mean. It's not that it's not urgent. I completely agree with Doug that a 25% cut in benefits is unacceptable. So here are three ideas that would help close the solvency gap for Social Security. One would be to raise the tax max, that is the maximum tax on Social Security on payrolls, which now goes up to about, what is it, around 120K. Goes up to around 120K. That covers about 84% of earnings. It used to cover 90% of earnings. Take it back to 90%. So raise the tax max. Bernie wanted to take it all. He wanted to completely get rid of the tax max. So I'm being moderate here. So raise the tax max back to 90%. Increase the payroll tax from by about 40 basis points, or about 0.4%. And here's a new one that I'm not sure if you're familiar with, but I think it's really good. Include employer-sponsored insurance as part of the payroll tax base. So right now, when employers provide insurance for you, it's untaxed. This is actually a fairly wasteful thing to do. That should be included in the payroll tax base for Social Security. Those three ideas would get you most of the way to closing the solvency gap. I'm not saying they're easy, but neither am I saying they're impossible. And by the way, the idea that somehow, and I totally agree with Doug, it's not just the Affordable Care Act, but the idea that somehow, you can wave your hands and say that healthcare savings haven't materialized over the last few years is just factually wrong. It's just wrong.
You can trace them to the ACA.
I think the ACA, you can't, yes, I think that the ACA is part of the solution, but I don't think it's the whole thing. I agree with that.
In the historical footnote, I'm the guy who in the McCain campaign opposed exactly that Social Security.
Oh, so we agree?
The politics that are great.
No, these are very heavy lifts. These are all heavy lifts, but by the way, so is getting rid of this stuff.
So here's my point. I don't want to fight about numbers, but the next person is going to walk into the Oval Office, and some nerdy person like me is going to wander over from OME and say, "Sir, madam, we have a problem." They're going to put down the 8-year budget outlook and say, "Okay, so we need to take about 3 percentage points of GDP just to sort of hold this thing at bay. And now you're going to want another 2 percentage points of GDP for all your new programs. That's great. And if we really want to get ahead of the Social Security and Medicare problem, we're going to need even more than that. So let's just call it 6. So let's raise taxes by 1/3 at the federal level. We're growing at under 2%. You don't have to be a raving supply-sider to suggest that that's going to have negative impacts. And odds are there's going to be a recession on the watch of the next president, and that's not going to happen. So I don't think the money you so casually raise is there. I don't. I mean,
but do you agree? Do you agree that revenue should be on the table?
You and I have always said we had a discussion. The route to revenue is through tax reform. It should be on the table. It was on the table in Bull Simpson. They got there. there's no reason why that can't happen.
I think that's good.
Let me ask you guys to bring together two of the themes that we've been talking about, because I think the question that Bob put was, is it possible to balance the budget and balance incomes at the same time? Which is to say that when you're talking about entitlement reform and trying to put Social Security and Medicare on a sustainable path, can you do that? Can you see your way to doing that without exacerbating the income inequality problem? Because I hear in what the proposals that Jared's bringing up is mostly, an anxiety about making sure that you reform Social Security in a way that doesn't go straight to the neediest people.
I think the answer is yes. I mean, I don't have a big problem with that. Just, it has always confused and mystified me why the left, and I'll just point at Jared, not because to make it personal, but I've never understood why it's so important to get $1 of tax revenue from a Warren Buffett or a Bill Gates or a name your rich person, Donald Trump, but it's not okay to take $1 of the benefits away. I will never understand that. So I would be happy to have very aggressive means testing on Social Security and on Medicare and all of these spending programs, which would lower the deficit and would take steps in the right direction on the inequality front. And I view that as a no-brainer, but it's not been my side that's been opposed to that.
No, you're not listening, because a few minutes ago I said, and I said this at some, I said this with my aunt, looking over my shoulder a little bit, that I absolutely think that benefits should be on the table. So now the thing about benefits, so this is the idea that if you're going to get to a compromise on Social Security and Medicare, it's going to take higher revenues and lower benefits. And I think, that's called compromise, and we've kind of forgotten how to do that in Washington, but it used to be the way we solved problems like this, and I think we're going to have to get back to that. My only caveat, and where I maybe that takes me out of what you call the left, but I've said this already tonight, I'll say it again. My only caveat is that I don't want to break Social Security to fix it, so I think you have to be mindful of whose benefits you're cutting. So you mentioned the fact that Social Security takes elderly poverty down from 44% to 9%.
So I'm talking about taking more about
yeah.
entirely.
So exactly. So to the extent that you're taking benefits from folks who will be fine without them, I certainly don't have a problem with that. I think, and then by the way, here's another place where I depart from the left and even from Hillary Clinton, which is, frankly, when I talk about new revenues, I'm not just talking about people above $250,000. For example, I think we need some higher gas tax, and that would hit a lot of people. That's not a progressive tax. So look, revenue, what is it? Taxes are what you pay to be a member of a civilized society, and we simply can't continue to promise this and collect that. Now, we can try to bring that down a little bit, and I'm happy to try, but we also got to bring this up.
Can I ask you, again, to comment a little bit on the way the presidential campaign has gone? Because I'm kind of wondering whether I've romanticized campaigns of the past, that there have been candidates that have put out, bold solutions to difficult problems. Doug, you were involved in the McCain campaign. Do you feel like that our system can accommodate, our political system can any longer accommodate serious policy discussions in political campaigns?
It certainly hasn't. I mean, honestly.
Ever?
Recently. I mean, I think
Recently, yeah.
what I would say is, I would say if you looked at 2000, 2004, 2008, I would describe all of those as fairly policy-rich campaigns, whether it was tax cuts, whether you liked them or not. I mean, Bush talked about Social Security reform, tax cuts, a variety of things. 2004 was about the war, foreign policy, how we think about that. 2008, there were climate change proposals, there were healthcare reform proposals, there were tax reform proposals, both sides. I thought Obama was empty. It was like really, really thin policy-wise, and this is worse. So I'm quite despondent about the near-term trajectory of the policy discussion. I will say, it's hard. The environment in which you do policy work on a campaign is one of the most difficult things I've ever done. Everybody hates you. If you're the policy guy, they hate you. Because you're the person who says things like, well, that's not true. You can't say that. It's like Jared's saying, here, I mean, so there's a political class, a set of political consultants that flow from campaign to campaign, whose ultimate goal is to have infinite flexibility to the last minute. That makes no sense to me, because if you haven't said this is what I want to do when I get elected, you're going to mandate to do anything.
Right.
There was a real battle to to get some things done. And quite frankly, you know, I give John McCain a lot of credit. He said to us, I want bold solutions, I want you to design them. We did. He backed them up, but a lot of them caused some real political heat. This business of taxing the value of employer-sponsored insurance.
That's right, I remember
Produced
yeah.
two things. One, a political ad that is still the most run political ad ever. Glenn Kessler actually told me this. So we produced that, and a pretty good drinking problem. I mean,
I mean, one of the reasons, so
it's hard. I'm sympathetic to why people tiptoe away from this. It's never going to be easy.
You're right.
I mean, I agree with that. And, you know, a guy like Doug is, if you put him in the middle of the campaign, you're going to have policy discussions because that's what he brings to the table. And I think that was useful, even though at the time I was probably telling you they were all wrong.
You said that for a long time.
Yeah. I actually kind of disagree. I think there's been a lot of policy discussion, and some of it's been really important, interesting. Some of it's even salutary. It's just been very much secondary to all the sensational stuff. I'll give you a couple of examples. So on trade. Trade policy has been elevated in a way that I've never seen before. Now, I'm not saying it's the most elucidating discussion we've ever had on the topic, but in a way, Trump and Sanders contributed to this as well, have given a voice to a deep and real problem in this country that hasn't been talked about. Elites on both sides have basically said to people who've said, look, globalization has really hurt us and our communities for decades, has said, you know, you just don't understand the benefits of trade, and here's another trade agreement and a little bit of trade adjustment assistance, and, you know, climb on board. That genie has been taken out of the bottle, and I think that's a real plus. However, it has to be very carefully dealt with, or we're going to tilt towards protectionism, which is, you know, I think where Donald Trump is coming from. He envisions a 1950s nostalgic America, which we're not going back to. So I'm much more partial to Hillary Clinton, who says globalization will continue apace, but we have to reshape it so that, for example, at the heart of our trade agreements are not just corporate interests, but the interests of working people, of the environment, of consumers. And I actually think that's been a very salutary agreement, discussion. I think you guys, probably Doug, Janet, and Bob, are all kind of upset that debt and deficits haven't come up more in this campaign. And frankly, I'm not either that surprised or that upset, and I'll tell you why. One reason why debt and deficits would come up more at a time like this is because that they were clearly having a negative impact on the economy, either now or in the future. And the way you would see that is through what economists call crowd out. That is, there'd be some suggestion that government borrowing, either current or projected, would be crowding out private borrowing, crowding out private investment. And that would be evident in rising interest rates. And in fact, every forecaster has interest rates going up, going up, going up, and then the numbers come in, and it turns out they've been really low. Now that doesn't mean that crowd out is impossible, that we don't have anything to worry about, but I don't believe that the campaigns are going to really bring you anything insightful or interesting about a problem that is just, you know, not really there in front of you. Whereas if you think about trade, if you think about inequality, if you think about income stagnation, you know, those problems are real and they're staring us in the face.
So I think we're just about out of time, but I feel like Doug should get one more. Do you want to have the last word here?
Certainly.
Because I do think that it's actually great listening to you guys argue with each other because you do kind of come at these problems with different points of view, and it's kind of, like I said, it's kind of refreshing because you're right about trade being brought out during the campaign, but for the most part, when the candidates engage with each other, they don't have as much fun as you two have been having.
We're not running for office.
So I'm going to both agree and disagree with Jared, not surprisingly. I'm going to agree that I understand why debt deficits per se have not arisen, because nobody likes green eye shade CBO style discussions on campaigns. And I'm also saddened but not surprised by the kinds of campaigns increasingly we see, because I did learn on the McCain campaign that, you know, while I'm all about puppies, kittens, and sunshine, it's fear and anger that are political motivators. And So if you can tap into fear, identify someone to be angry at, that's quite powerful, and we've seen that. I'm not happy about it, but that's a reality that I've learned about. So you know, by comparison, you know, $1 trillion, I mean, it's like not too exciting. However, underneath those budgetary difficulties are what I believe to be a deep unraveling of A, the social safety net, which is not sustainable in any deep financial form and is not performing as well as I'd like, and B, a breaking of the contract that has sustained this country through a millennia, which is we'll leave to the next generation an economy that is as large and as strong, and a nation that is as secure as the one we inherited, or better, and we're not going to do that. And that discussion, the fundamental immorality of what we're doing to the next generation, I think absolutely dwarfs any of the issues of income inequality between Jared and I, or anything at this point in time. I believe that's the fundamental thing that's been left out of this campaign, and I was really surprised about.
Great. Well, thank you, gentlemen. It's really been a pleasure.
So we do have time for one or two audience questions, so I'm going to hand it over. He has a question.
I got 5 minutes.
Okay.
I got to catch a plane tonight, so
First, I want to thank you for coming. This has been a great discussion, and I come at this with a little bit of a personal experience from 3 different perspectives. 1, I served in Congress. 2, I ran an embassy. Denmark, which was actually the one that Bernie Sanders loves the most, not Sweden. And 3, I'm an architect, so I build communities, particularly new markets in emerging economies overseas. And you didn't mention 2 things which I think are very important in this whole discussion, which I'd like you to comment on. One is the attitude the attitude of the American worker today. Our productivity is as dependent upon having a job to work as it is to feel good about that job and to work hard. And I think that we see, as you have commented, that the disposition of the country is very negative. It's very much down in the mouth.
I got 5 minutes. I'll get to your question.
And I will, and I appreciate you staying to hear it. So I'd like you to comment on how does one provide the leadership in a presidential campaign to bring that morale up to a place where it will be more productive. Number 2 is there's rampant waste throughout the U.S. government. I've seen that from all 3 perspectives, rampant waste. And for an example, I have seen how you can save 20% on construction costs, on energy and operational costs in the built environment. So that's something you haven't talked about at all. And I'd like you to talk on those 2 points, please.
You know, I think Hillary Clinton is trying to run this campaign, at least rhetorically, she's stronger together. So she is trying, at some points, it looks to me like she's trying to take the high road, and then at other points, clearly, she's just, mud wrestling with her opponent. So I don't have a great answer to, what a candidate could do to increase the country's morale. At my worst moments.
Change was Obama.
Exactly. So, at my worst moments, what did they say? I read something the other day, this morning, Paul Krugman writes a column, why do Republicans hate America? And, I don't see it that way. But I kind of feel like Donald Trump has maybe kind of broken America a little bit. By elevating the level of divisiveness and hatefulness that I guarantee, it's just not where Hillary Clinton is, it's not who she is, it's not where Barack Obama is, it's not where Mitt Romney is, it's far from where John McCain is. So this guy is a uniquely toxic person, and I think he's taken that problem and exacerbated it. I don't have much to say, beyond that. I will say one economic point. There's a great article in the New York Times, sorry, the other day, she writes for the Wall Street Journal, about how workers' morale was really low at Walmart and that they were doing a crappy job and the customers were complaining and sales were going down, the shelves were in stock, you couldn't find somebody. And what did Walmart do? They decided to raise pay. And guess what? They started it wasn't just a matter of raising labor costs, thus lowering profits. In fact, they've been doing better. revenues and sales have gone up. And morale is really high compared to where it was. So there's that to me is a pretty important lesson. You get what you pay for, and it's hard to really gin up a nation that is, I think, taking a moral high ground when many of the economic trends that we've been describing have just been driving people's pay down year after year after year. So I agree with Doug that at a very fundamental level, not just economic growth, because GDP growth won't do it by itself. It's necessary but not sufficient. The middle class has to have enough bargaining power so that more of that growth goes their way. And on that note, I'm going to go to Boston. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I believe it would be unfair for me to go off on Jared in his absence. Although I know his lines by heart by now. Let me just say to your point, I would say on the leadership thing, a development in my lifetime has been that other sources of leadership have seemingly stepped away and left us with this over-reliance on presidential leadership in campaign years. The corporate community used to be civic leaders, and whether it's the excessive sort of audit of shareholder behaviors and things, they're just hiding. Right? They're afraid of saying the wrong thing in every earnings report, much less saying something the country might want to do. Basically, every institution is now held with great skepticism or worse by the American public. That's because institutional leadership, beginning at the community level, has not been what it should have been. So I think this one of these things is going to have to start it on. You can't just every 4 years wait for the same year to roll through. I don't think that's going to work. So that's the leadership piece of it. And as far as fraud, I'm going to agree with you that there's lots of waste, there's lots of fraud, there's not enough to solve the fundamental budget problems of the United States. That doesn't mean you shouldn't go after it. One mistake that is made sometimes is to identify the fact that it's not very big and say, well, then it's not worth going after. No, until the taxpayers genuinely believe you're spending the money well, it is going to be much harder to make the big changes. And so it's really important to get that, even though it will solve all the problems.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.